You are watching Darasa Online.
Dear students, welcome to Darasa Online. My name is Mr. Darcy. I teach English Language 1. The lesson is about principles of translation. And specifically, we are going to look at the principles of translation and interpretation. So this is the topic of our discussion. And so at the end of our discussion, I'm expecting that every one of us should be able to know the principles of translation, and or in other words, some other people call it the qualities of a good translator. So our discussion is going to be guided with a question that reads, how can a text be translated? How can a text be translated? So we cannot just straight go start looking at how can we translate something if we don't understand what does the word translation mean. In our major topic, as it reads interpretation and translation, the two concepts are said to be synonymous, but technically they are different. They are synonymous in a sense that what they do is just to convert the meaning or the idea which are represented or which are presented in one language and transform them to another language. That is what they share in common. But technically, as we say, they are different because how do you go about interpretation? It is when you transform the idea being spoken from one language to another language. And translation has to do with transforming idea which are written in one language and you take it into another language. So that is the only difference. But basically, the two, they have the same thing in common that they share, because what the translator do, it is the same thing that an interpreter does. So the principles that we are going to see here, in most cases, they are shared. There are some small elements which they differ, and which in fact, I will be trying to clarify that this one is basically for interpretation and or for translation. But if I don't do so, just know that whatever we are going to say, they are shared by both translation and interpretation. And again, since our intention is to transform the meaning being presented in one language to another language, then here we of course need to be able to know the meaning of the text being written in one language, and that you'll be able to take it to the meaning being presented in another language. which I also want you again to know the two terms which I might sometimes be using them when I will be talking about translation and interpretation. These two terms are called source language and target language. The SL and the TL. Source language, it could also be a source text, and target language could also be a target text. So this source text and target text, it depends. We are not bound of saying maybe it is Kiswahili that should be a source language and it is English that should be a target language. It can be any language provided this text is presented in that language. If I write using French, that is a source text. And if I am expecting my reader to get it in Kiswahili, then that Kiswahili will be the target text. So in that language, it doesn't matter which language comes first and which one comes later. So the one that comes first, that will be referred to be source language, and the one that comes later after the text been transformed its idea or meaning, that will be the target language. So those are the two things that I wanted you not to confuse about. But otherwise, let us look at the principles that will finally help us to see how can a text be translated.
You are watching Darasa Online.
Principle number one is competence. That a translator needs to be competent in the use of both source language and target language. He or she has to have a good command of the two languages. And when we are talking about having a good command of both languages, we are talking about this person should be able to understand the morphology, the syntactical part, the structure in general, the way how we pronounce, and the meaning of different expressions. Having a knowledge of all these language abilities, it will help him or her to translate text accordingly. Because if you lack one of these ability, there's a great possibility that a text which you are going to translate might be lacking some of the important details. Let's examine this sentence and try to see how should it look like when someone is asked to translate it. Mtoto wa shule ya sekondari anacheza mpira wa meza. This is a Swahili sentence. So when someone is being asked to translate this text, then as I said, it depends on his or her competence, on how he or she knows the two languages. And since, of course, there are different ways, different methods that a person might apply to translate a text from one language to another language, then it depends which one he or she uses. One could translate this sentence as Look at this translation that reads, child of school of secondary playing ball of table. A person might say, this is a translation of this text. What actually a person has done here, he or she has decided simply to change the words from one language to another language. And this normally is done when a person has to observe the structure of the source text. So when you observe the structure of the source text, you might sometimes somehow find that the meaning which you finally present, it might be either understood and or might not be understood. It might be understood only to the people who learn that language as their target language or as their second language. But for those who speak that language as the first language, it becomes difficult for them to understand, just like what and how it has been presented here. Now, whoever does this kind of a translation, we say he or she uses a direct method of how a text can be translated. That you change word instead of understanding the meaning of what has been said, but you only look at what does this word will look like in another language. That's what and how it has been applied here. That is one way of how people can translate a text like this. Now, being competent in the two languages, a person, as we say, he or she needs to know the structure and the morphology of the language as well. Then let's see the other kind of translation. Now, this could be the second version of the same text, that a secondary school child is playing table tennis. Now, this translation is different from the previous translation. That at this point, the person did not look at the change of the words or the change of the individual words in the source text, but rather he had decided to understand what is communicated. And at the same time, he or she has decided to observe the structure of the target language. So when you're observing the structure of the target language, you find the arrangement of some of the words might change. And this is what we talk about, the structure of a sentence. That languages are not the same. The word ordering are not the same. It depends on which language you are talking about. So as you can see, the arrangement of words in the target language is different from the source text. And that's what I was saying, that one should observe the structure. So being competent in both source language and target language, then one needs to know how does the source language structure look like, and how does the target language structure looks like. So understanding the structure of the two languages will help you to know that how can you organize your words to make a sentence that fits and qualify to the language of your choice, whether it being a source language or a target language. And this kind of a translation, we call it literal translation. But apart from this, there are some other texts which, when you are given, there's no way you can think about maybe trying to look at the organization of the words. But you need to learn, or we need to read them from the beginning towards the end, trying to understand what is it that the writer wishes to communicate. And when you understand in relation to the context in which that word or that text appears, then by using your own words and or by thinking about the equivalent expression, that you'll be able to communicate what it has been said. Look at this example sentence. Samaki mkunje angali mbichi. What does this mean? It's only when you understand the meaning of this expression that you would be able to give an equivalent expression for that matter. If you are to translate this expression or this text just as the way you did in the previous other two, what you are going to communicate finally will be different from what the source text means. So if I have to say the equivalent expression of this samaki mkunje angali mbichi, I might think of something like this. A stitch in time saves 9. So when you look at the meaning of the two texts, they're all trying to say that a problem has to be solved at its earliest stage. Well, the Swahili speaker, again, instead of samaki mkunje angali mbichi, they will say usipoziba ufa utajenga ukuta, or mtoto umleavyo ndivyo akuavyo. So you can have all these other expressions, but still the equivalent expression could be the same. And with this, we call it communicative translation. Communicative translation, whereby a person has to communicate the intended meaning that the source text is trying to communicate.
You are watching Darasa Online.
But again, a person, for him to perform this task of translation and interpretation, he or she has to understand the field covered and or the subject matter. The question here comes, why? Why should a person understand the field covered and or the subject matter? He or she has to understand the field covered and or the subject matter because there are some other technical words or other expressions which might be said in that language, and if he or she is not able to understand, it could be difficult for him to transform the idea from one language to another language. Let's assume that the text has been written by using legal language, or it is a scientific text. And here comes a translator who happened to have not gone through legal law, or happened to have not gone to legal schools. And also this other person has not gone to scientific schools. It is obvious that this person might not be able to translate the text because there would be some technical expressions and or some other expressions in that field that this person has not understood. So this is the reason why we are saying a person has to understand the field covered or the subject matter that he or she is going to translate. Number 3. Loyalty. For a person to be a good translator or an interpreter, he or she has to be loyal. He or she has to be faithful. He has to hold on his or her beliefs. Because what you are supposed to do is to transform the text or the source text written in one language to another language without including or associating your own personal opinions. Because if you involve your personal opinions or your personal views of whatever has been said, end of the day, you might come up with a text or a translated text which is different from what the source speaker or the source text wanted you to make it. So this is the reason why we are told that we should be faithful, trying to say only what the source text wants you to say, and not otherwise. Number 4. Flexibility. That the interpreter and or the translator has to be flexible. Why flexible? We want him to be flexible because the first thing that you do is to have to look at what are you expecting your audience to have. So in simple language, you have to look at the expectation of your reader or the expectation of your audience. Try to look at the style which the source text or the source language presents the message. And look again if the audience would be able to understand the message. So if you find that the audience might have some difficulties to understand the message just because of the style that has been used to present the work, and this is where now the translator and or the interpreter has to be flexible, has to violate and or to maintain the style that has been used by the source text. So violating and or maintaining the style, that one will depend on whether the message will be understood by the audience and or not. This is very important because the intention of doing this is to make the message being understood. So if you keep on maintaining the same style that you think the audience might not be able to understand, then the work you're doing is nothing. Finally, that a translator and an interpreter should be aware that there are some content items in both languages, source language and target language, that are difficult to be translated. So when he or she is aware of those items that are difficult to be translated, when he or she comes across them during the process, then he or she would be able to know what he or she should do to make whatever has been said understood by the audience or by the reader. Because when we are talking about these items which are difficult to be translated, it is like language is cultural bound. And when we talk about language being cultural bound, that means what I have in my language is not necessary to be found in another language. Or the item that I have here in my society, it's not necessary that it could be found in the other area. So I might give a name to the item that I have in my society, which, since it is not found in another society where they use another language, they might miss a word to use to referring the same thing. When that situation comes, the translator and or the interpreter has to know what to do to make the audience understand, even though that entity is not found in their target language. What are these content items that are difficult to be translated? Items that are difficult to be translated. The first one is proper noun. Proper nouns, we are referring to words which name specific things or specific objects. And this specific object or things could be things like human beings, people, could be ocean, could be mountains, could be names of places, could be rivers, and such things. So all words which they are trying to name these things, we call them proper nouns. And since maybe these proper nouns, they can be found in some specific area and not everywhere in this world, that is the reason why we say it will be difficult for some people to translate those words. For example, you have a name of a place here in Tanzania reading Dar es Salaam. And somebody has written a text. Inside it, there is a word Dar es Salaam. And the text is in Kiswahili. Now that you are asked to transform that text from Swahili to English, other words are common. But in between, as I say, you have the word Dar es Salaam. How are you going to transform this word into English? After all, do we know Dar es Salaam is in Swahili or English? So since this place is only found in Tanzania and not in other areas in the world, that's when we have to make sure we do not change this word. So it has to remain as it is. Think about the Mount Kilimanjaro. So the word Kilimanjaro cannot in any way be transformed in any other language, because it is the only one that exists in the world. But sometimes you might come across with some words. They might be found in two different languages, and as they are referring to the same thing. But sometimes, somehow it confuses, and people fail to know what and how they should use it. For example, you have this word Europe. It's a continent. But the same continent in Kiswahili, some other people refer it as Ulaya. So when you come across with the word Europe in your text, do you have to translate this word into the word Ulaya? Will that give the same meaning? Now this one, it has been left a task to a translator to decide when he or she has an equivalent term, should he use that equivalence and or should he maintain the same? But if I may to advise, I would advise you to use the original word that has been used in the source text, provided that word falls under proper noun. Imagine someone is called John. I'm told that the Swahili word for John is Johanna. Your ID bears a name of John. Now you have been given a check named Johanna and you go to the bank. Do you think those people will know that Johanna stands for John? They look at these two as two different people. That's why we are saying such kind of words are not supposed to be translated. They need to be left as they are. Another item which is difficult to be translated is trade and company names. Sometimes you can even include the names of the institutions. These trade and company names or name of institutions or parastatus, they are more or less the same as proper nouns because they are trying to name a particular thing, a particular entity. The only difference from proper noun is that these trade and company names, you can have 2 or 3 words referring to the same entity. For example, think about Coca-Cola Kwanza Limited. Coca-Cola Kwanza Limited. The 3 words naming the same thing. You cannot talk about these individual words as they are referring to different items. Just like when you talk about the word John as it refers to one person. So here we have many words referring to the same thing. That's why we categorize them as different items that are difficult to be translated. Think about another company name like Mtibwa Sugar Company. Think about Younger Sports Club and many more others. Those are called trade and company names or names of institutions. When we come across them in a text, we find difficulties to translate them. Another item which gives difficulties in translation is the acronyms. Acronyms are words which are formed by taking the initial letters of different words and you combine them together to form a new word, and that new word is kept on being used. And since it is repeatedly being used, then it is common now to be understood by many people. Think about Think about a word like CCM. Think about a word like CUF. Think about a word like Tazara. These are what we refer them as acronyms. The letters stands to represent a complete word. For instance, Chama cha Mapinduzi, Civic United Front, Tanzania Zambia Railway Authority. These are words which we use them as we speak and even when we write. When we come across them, how are you going to translate them? These are other items which, when it comes to translation, we face difficulties or we face challenges to translate. Though there are other institutions who their names have been acronymized in these forms and they have been given them in 2 different languages. For example, you have this PCCB. And this PCCB, you can find some other people, they refer the same thing in Kiswahili as TAKUKURU. So when you come across a text bears PCCB, and that's an English text maybe, and they want you to transform it in Kiswahili, will you transform PCCB to TAKUKURU? Will it bear the same meaning? Anyway, that one will depend again. But as I said, what we are advised when we come across with these expressions, we should leave them as they are. Because the reader or the audience will, of course, understand what does it stand to represent. And in fact, if they don't understand, they will keep on asking and or making follow-up, making references to know what does that acronym mean. Another item which is difficult to be translated, it is the proverbs, the idioms, the phrasal verbs. Together, we call them idiomatic expressions. Idiomatic expressions. That these are expressions which had fixed meaning and they are culturally being understood. You cannot understand the meaning of these idiomatic expressions just by looking at the individual words. They have got some special meaning that has been attached to these words. You might know the meaning of some of the individual words in that language or in the source language. But if you want to translate them the way you understand, you'll find you're going to distort the meaning of whatever it has been mentioned. Think of an expression like a Swahili one. Ana mkono mrefu is an idiom. Swahili speakers know when you say so and so ana mkono mrefu, it simply means they talk about a person being a thief. But think about, if you have been given this expression and someone asks you to transform it in English, if you want now try to look at these individual words and think about how can you make them in English, then whatever meaning you're going to get will of course be distorted. And so, this qualifies idiomatic expression to have some difficulties and challenges for a person to translate. Because these idiomatic expressions, they are culturally bound. So it is only when a person knows the equivalence or the equivalent expression of this one, which is found in another language, that can make a person being able to translate it. But otherwise, a person would only paraphrase what it has been said. And when you paraphrase it, that means it loses its beauty. And that's why at the beginning we said, for a person to be a good translator, he or she has to be competent in both source language and target language. In other words, you need also to understand the culture of the two languages. And apart from idiomatic expressions, you can as well talk about the sayings. Different expressions that people are using when they're talking of expressing the culture of their society. It also has some difficulties to translate. Think about kick the bucket. It is a saying. Now, when you want to say it in Kiswahili, I know what you think. Now, what you have thought, it is quite a bit different from the meaning which is expressed here. So you'll be forced in one way or another to use just a simple word by saying maybe a person has died. So in that case, what we are trying to say in all these, that for a person to be a good translator, he has to be able to know that there are these content items that they are sometimes challenged, sometimes difficult to be translated. So when he or she comes across them, what he or she is supposed to do, there are some that we have said that you can leave them the way they are. But others, you need to know how can you translate them by looking at the equivalences. And if at all they are there in the language or in the target language. Having gone through the qualities of a good translator, or rather an interpreter, that you have all these qualities, now you have been given a text for you to translate. How do you go about it? Of course, that is when now you have to know the differences between a translator and an interpreter. Because when you are given a task to perform or transform a text from one language to another language, that will depend on whether you are a translator or an interpreter. So if you are a translator, So if you're a translator, what do you have to do? You have the task ahead you. You have the text there. How are you going to translate that? There are stages that one has to go through. The first thing, a translator has to go through the whole text. You have to read from the beginning towards the end. When you read, you are trying to know the general overview of the text. Not only the general overview of the text, you need also to see if there are things that you'll need during the process of translation. So if there are dictionaries that you need, and any other resource that you'd want to have during the process, it is the first task that will tell you. Now the second task that you do is you have to collect all the necessary resources that you'd want. As I said, the first task a translator has to do is to go through the whole text. As you read, it will tell you what do you need to have, what kind of a consultation that you have to do. So the second thing is you try now to go around and see what is it that you need, and then you collect it all together, so that when you start making the process, you should not be disturbed by saying, oh, I don't have this, I don't want. No. You sit down and you start doing your task as you are required to. And when you are satisfied that you are having all the resources that you want, then you go to stage number 3, whereby you have to write the first draft. You have to write the first draft. When you are through with the first draft, then you go to the fourth, is you review the draft. When you review the draft, that means you'll have to read the draft to check if there are some mistakes that you have made. Spelling errors, grammar, vocabularies, if are appropriate or not, and many more other things related to. In simple language, you are editing your work. Now, upon satisfaction, then that's when you'll have to write the final draft, ready for consumption. And from there, you say, that is the work of translation which you have been given to perform. And as I said, you write the final draft depending on the expectation or the interest of the reader or of the customer. This is a translator. But an interpreter, since he or she does his or her work orally, then we cannot say he has to write the first draft or he has to write the final draft. But all what he has to do is to transform the message being presented from one language to another language orally. So he has to stand and or sit next to the source speaker. So a speaker will come first, and then the translator will try to understand what has been spoken and then transform it to the language which the audience expect to hear. So in this case, they'll have to give chances to each other. One speaks first, the source speaker, and then this translator is somewhere listening. And when the source speaker finishes, then the interpreter takes part and then transform what the source speaker was trying to say. That one, we call it consecutive type of interpretation. We call it consecutive interpretation. That I speak first, and then I give time for my interpreter to speak. We cannot speak at a time when the other one speaks, unless there are those who, when they go for the translation, that I give you what I want you to say in advance, so that when I speak, you also speak. And that one, they call it simultaneous. That the two people are speaking at the same time. But mostly what is used in interpretation is this consecutive one. Because I have to speak, you listen what I speak, and then end of the day, you translate or you transform that what you heard from me. That is in interpretation. But in interpretation, since it has to do with face-to-face interaction, then the interpreter needs to understand everything that has been said by the source speaker. If he finds himself or herself not to have understood, then he better has to ask, what does this and this and this mean? So that he should be sure of what he or she is going to present. Not only that, the kind of a voice that the interpreter has to use, he or she is also advised to use the same way as the source speaker. If the source speaker has spoken very high, then the interpreter has to do the same, so that the audience should not know the difference. It is also advised that the interpreter has to use the same gestures, the same movements, and sometimes even the same facial expressions. Which again, this one is a bit difficult, because you might not be in a position to know what kind of a movement I am going to make, what kind of a facial expression that I'm going to make. But as I said, it is advised that the interpreter has to use the same gestures that the source speaker use. So those you can see, they are making it different from a translator. Now, apart from that, the clear differences between the two, you can categorize them in these ways. Mode of their presentation, that how a translation work is done, and how do we make interpretation. Remember, we said translation has to do with writing, and interpretation has to do with speaking. That is number one. Number two, you're talking about the participants who are involved in the process. That the participants that you have in translation, you find the translator is all alone during the task. The audience or the readers, they are somewhere unknown places. Different from interpretation, whereby the participants during the process, they are all present at the scene. You have the source speaker, you have the interpreter, and you have the audience at the same place. So which means here there is face-to-face interaction. Now, since there is face-to-face interaction, it is easy to know the feelings of the speaker when he or she speaks. In translation, you cannot get the feeling of the person who is writing. That is another difference. But also, the other clear difference between translation and interpretation is time frame. That translation, it is said to consume a lot of time, while interpretation, it does not. Since in translation, you have to make a planning, you have to use the first draft, you edit, you go to the last draft or final draft, then you find yourself, you spend a lot. While in interpretation, you don't have to think about the first draft, the edition, and the second draft, or the final draft. The work is done at the moment. So that means the time you spend in translation is quite a lot. And lastly, you talk about resources. In translation, of course, it is said to be a bit costful because you need to buy some of the things that you need to use during the process. While interpretation is only what you have to do is to simply hire the translator by himself and leave him to go through the work. So it is less costful. Now that you see these differences and you know what a translator has to do and what an interpreter has to do, then you have the final work. You have a translation. You have an interpretation. I'm talking about the product now. It's not the process anymore. That a text has been translated from one language to another language. That becomes a translation. So you have to ask yourself now, is this translation of quality? That someone has transformed the idea from one language to another language. Has he made it to be understood? Is it understood in the way that is supposed to be done? So this is where some other people sometimes try to look at how quality the translated work is. I repeat, they need to look at how quality the translated work is. Quality of translation. It should not be confused. When I said, remember at the beginning, we call principles of translation, we said they are more or less like qualities of a good translator. But here I'm talking about quality of translation. How can a person know that this translated work, it is of quality? There are three things that a person can do. Dear student, these three things that you have to do, they are like tests. You are trying to testify if this translated work, it is of quality or not. The first one is called performative test, and followed by knowledge test, and finally you have back translation. Performative test, it has to do with asking people to perform the same activity by using two different languages, the source language and the target language. And if you find them, they have performed the same activity despite being asked using two different languages, then you qualify that translation, say it is of high quality. In other hand, when we talk about knowledge testing, it is when you ask people similar question or the same question by using two languages, the source language and the target language. And if you happen to have the same response, then again you talk about that translation is being of high quality. Which the last task is back translation, whereby you ask a person to translate a text into the original text. So you find you have the source text being translated into a target language. Then you give the target language for another person to translate it back to the original text. Then if you find the translated text is similar to the original, then you say again, this translation, it is of high quality. But all in all, whether the text is of high quality after it being translated or not, I want you to remember that in most cases, what we do in this exercise, we are trying to understand what it has been said, and you say them in the language that the audience would understand. In simple language, we are trying to paraphrase what it has been said in one language and what is going to be said in another language. Sometimes people get difficulties to do that. Maybe because the way they think. You know, we differ in thinking. I think in English, and at the same time I can think in Kiswahili. Try ask yourself, which language do you normally use to think? So if you think in Kiswahili while you want to say it in English, you would find yourself in all the time using some English words as you speak Kiswahili. So when it comes to translation, you also find similar difficulties that you're going through. That you'd want to say the expressions which have been said in English as you are thinking them in Kiswahili. Remember, translation, it is a task that needs a person, first of all, to be patient, and again, to be hard work. So in order for you to have these qualities and being able to translate works from one language to another language, you need to do a lot of practices.
You are watching Darasa Online.
Having the knowledge of principles of translation and all the qualities of a good translator, plus the methods of translation and the stages of translation, and many more other material that we have shared today, I believe right now when you are given a text, it will be easier for you to transform it from one language to another language, which again, that will depend on whether you have been asked to change it with a direct method, literal method, or communicative one. But mostly the recommended method that we should always apply in transforming a text from one language to another language, we are requested to use communicative translation. That you read the whole text or you read the whole sentence, try to understand what it communicates, And if possible, by using your own words, try to say, what does the source text mean? Let's look at the sentences that I prepared for you. Sentence number 1 reads, epuka kushikana mikono na kukumbatiana katika kipindi hiki cha homa ya mapafu. Sentence number 2 goes like, nawa mikono kwa sabuni mara nyingi kadri iwezekanavyo kwa kutumia maji yanayotiririka. Sentence number 3, tumia vitakasa mikono. Sentence number 4, vaa barakoa. Sentence number 5, epuka mikusanyiko na safari zisizo za lazima. And the last one is, tumuombe Mungu atuepushe na balaa hili. So as I said, the knowledge that you have with these kind of sentences, that you'd be able to translate Swahili sentences into English language. And I'm advising that you should use the communicative type of translation. Thank you very much for listening.